Hello everybody, my name is Sean Olson. I'm the developer of Wallworm. I was a tech artist for the game Black Mesa for the final few years of its development. I now serve as a member of the product management team for Autodesk for 3ds Max. I haven't really had a lot of time in the last few years to really share a lot of the documentation and examples that I'd like to teach all of you on using Wallworm to build really cool environments for the source engine. But right now I'm working on a project with my son Ethan on the weekends, and I thought this would be a great opportunity for me to walk you through a few of the things that are in Wallworm to show you some of the opportunities that aren't always documented, or sometimes they get documented and I change it and haven't had the time to really update that stuff. So I'm working on a small project here. It's a CSGO map. It's kind of a remap of a level I made many years ago for 1.6, and wanted to make a really cool environment around the main temple area and really kind of do some sculpting of the terrain in some of the ways that we did for Black Mesa, for the Zen chapters, but for this environment. So what I'm going to show you is how to quickly create a terrain and start sculpting. So what I did here, I didn't record myself making it, but I have this mesh, a single mesh in the scene. I'm going to hit F4 on the keyboard to bring up edge faces. So what I did was made this template of the places that I want to create displacements from. And if you're not familiar with what displacements in the source engine are a type of geometry intended to be for terrains, allow you to sculpt it and blend materials on them. In this case, I had to set up the terrain a specific way because displacements in the source engine have a very specific technical requirement on how they're put together. Although I didn't record myself making that terrain, a template here, I took snapshots as I was making it. But I'm going to real quickly just do a little bit extra and talk about it so you can understand some of the things you have to keep in mind. The displacement terrain should always be made up of quads, or the brushes that you intend to turn into displacements. They always have to be quads. So if you want to turn something into a displacement, it must always be a four-sided polygon, and it's got to be convex. So that's very important. So as I was building this, I was very careful to make sure that all of the polygons are planar, they're convex, and they're quads. And then I used all kinds of tools in Max to kind of sculpt this out and put it together. One of them I'm going to show right now is called Shift Extrude. So you can really quickly extrude out faces in Max with this tool. It's a really cool feature that a lot of the developers and my coworkers at Autodesk put together for us to use for things like this. So I want to extrude this up, and I want to do it exactly to this vertex. So I want to keep them aligned to other polygons, and I'll explain why later. And an easy way to do that is to make sure I have snaps on, 3D snaps, and I have snap to vertex on. And by doing that, and also I want to make sure I have this axis constraints. So what's going to happen is I'm going to grab the Z axis, so I will only be moving in the Z axis. That's me. I'm going to hold down the Shift button, and I'm going to drag up. And I'm going to drag up to that vertex here, and you're going to see a little green icon appear. When I let go, that means that this is exactly aligned to this line here. And I'm going to do that to the next one. Shift drag up again. I'm going to do this again a few times, and I'll want to get this because I'm going to kind of want a spire that I'm going to sculpt out in an artistic way later on. And we'll do that to this top one. Now, by keeping these aligned, this allows me to do something that I wanted to do here, is that combine these. So you're going to notice in different places in this setup, I had kind of columns here, and I'm connecting across different areas. And what's going to happen is when these are displacements, that's going to allow me to like kind of sculpt these into arches. That's what I want to do. So in order to connect here, I can go to polygon mode, which I'm already in, select a couple polygons that are on the same plane or the same level as each other. I'm going to hit delete. I'm going to hit the 4 key to go to polygon subobject mode, or excuse me, 3 key. And I'm going to select both of those open borders. See how they have red around them. And once I have that, if I go over here in the Modify tab, you're going to see there's a button here that says Bridge. In this case, I only want one segment between them, but if I click open this little dialog here, it gives me options. So for example, I could say multiple, but I don't want them. I just want one going across. But in other areas, I use multiple to create a whole bunch of these going across here. So this is going to allow me to have this little like connection between this spire here and this wall here that's going to be in this kind of alcove area below a mountain and in a bay, a couple bays out into the ocean. And I wanted some spires and connection and arches just to give really cool things to look up and see as you're down below looking up to make a real interesting environment. So again, when you're making a template for your displacements, for your terrains for Source Engine, be very careful to keep things as quads. And the reason why I wanted to make sure that all of these polygons are exactly aligned in terms of the height of these is because if I tried to, at most angles, if I try to connect, say, this polygon up here to this one down here, there's a very good chance that the polygon will no longer be planar. So again, for this to work, you have to be very careful to make sure all of the polygons are planar. There cannot be any broken planes. They have to be planar quads across your template mesh. Now the next thing we're going to do is visualize the UVs on this, because as I sat through and made this, some of the UVs probably aren't what I want. We can visualize UVs in Max by clicking this standard button at the top left of the viewport and go to Material Overrides and turn on the UV checker. And you're going to see that any place where I stretched up I did the shift extruding, the smart extrude, or the bridging, the UVs are not accurate. So the next thing we're going to do here is I'm going to add a UV modifier. I can hit X and type in UVW, and you can see the second one on this list is UVW map. That lets me add a UVW map. I'm going to go back and get out of border subobject mode, get out of that so that I'm working on the whole mesh. And I'm going to actually, for this case, for the UV map, I'm going to put it on box map, and I'm going to set the length to repeat on this every 512 across all the dimensions. And I'm going to align this to the world origin and just offset it a little bit. So I'm going to go to you see this little arrow here that lets me get to the gizmo, lets me move the UVW map around. So if I select this, I can turn off snaps with S. I can move the UVs if I wanted to. I'm going to put it in a very specific spot. I'm going to put it at 256, 256, and 256 because my UVs are at 512, and this just aligns them a certain way. Now, I'm not really concerned with the UVs that much on this mesh because I'm going to be using what's called seamless scale on the material here, and seamless scale ignores the UVs. But I'm going to make them clean anyway and show you how to do this in this fashion, a quick way to do it across your entire mesh. So I'm going to we'll keep UVs on for a minute. So the next thing to consider here is I need enough geometry on my mesh to sculpt it the way I want. So right now, every single one of these polygons is going to get turned into a displacement. Okay, so notice that some of my polygons here are really huge. That can cause problems when we go to compile the level. The lighting can get messed up through the process called VRAD in compiling. And you can have different problems, especially if we're going to add water down the road. So we're going to add water, ocean out here in the beach areas. So I'm going to be mindful of this. So I want extra geometry for sculpting, and I am thinking about my light maps down the road. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to tessellate my mesh. So on top of here, I'm going to hit X again to bring up my search. I'm going to type in tessellate. And there's a modifier called tessellate. The first thing you're going to notice is it really messed up our geometry here. This is not what we want. We don't want the default settings at all because this will not work for displacements. You'll notice that first of all, almost all of the polygons are now tris. That doesn't work for displacements. They have to be quads. And they're no longer necessarily convex. So I'm going to go to polygons, and I'm going to change the tension down to 0. Now, you're going to notice that everything is basically, every polygon is kind of split down the middle. So if I turn this off just so you can visualize closer here, actually let me get out of the UV mode here, UV override, so it'd be easier to see here. So before I tessellate, it looks like that. When I enable my tessellate modifier, it broke it up. So now I'm going to have more geometry for my displacements. I'm going to hit G to hide my grid in the viewport. So just to show you how you can even up the number of polygons that are going to get turned into displacements, I could change the iterations to a higher number like this, and you're going to see it's going to get a lot more dense. I don't need it that dense. This will do for my purposes at 1. So the next thing we're going to want to do here is add a material to this, because when we create the displacements from this terrain, it will derive from it. So I opened up the VMT browser. This lets me see all of the materials that are in the game right now. And the one I want for the moment is just Dev Blend Measure 2. I'm going to double click the name on this list, and it's going to add it to that material, or to this object here. So this blend material is going to get applied to the terrain. One thing you are going to notice is that the values on this material may not align the same way as you'd think in Hammer, because the tiling in here is based off of the UVs inside of Max, versus in Hammer it was set to use world space size based off the bitmap size. So what I'm going to do to actually make it match what these numbers say is I can go back to my UV gizmo, UV map here. And if I type in 128, oops, typed in the wrong values there, and 128, then this is the actual size. And because I changed the size of this, I actually want to move it to 64. I want it to move it to half the size of this. So in this case, this is the value here would match what you would see in Hammer. It's something you have to get used to. In Max, things are done by the UVs rather than the texture size than Hammer, but it's just the way that they work. The way they store the data is different, and the way they represent it's different. But in the end, we're going to get the same net result. And now we're going to actually create displacements from this. So in the toolbars up here, and if you don't have them, you can always right-click an empty spot here, and you're going to see a bunch of Wallworm toolbars. And sometimes when you install it, they're all bunched up over here at the right. Sometimes you have to drag them out and move them. This is the orientation. All of these, this row of toolbars here and this one here come from Wallworm. One of them here, you're going to see it says launch the displacement floater. We're going to click that one. And it went to my other screen. I'm going to bring it over here, and I'm just going to dock it to the side for the moment. And okay, so I'm not going to explain what all of these options do here, but I'm going to explain that some of these settings in this first section will also equate to this section down here, this terrain and corridors one. And these are the ones that are important here. This is what we're going to use, but we're going to make sure the settings here are what we want. So we have a lot of displacements. I don't think they have to be power 3. I'm going to go down to power 2 displacements. And then this is the light map scale that's going to get applied to them by default, whatever you have on here. For the moment, I'm going to put these to maybe 32. And then I'll briefly explain what these do. What's going to happen here is when I click these different buttons, they take these values, and from these they create a displacement for each polygon. Okay. we have options here. So one of the options here says only blends. If that option is on and the mesh from which you're creating the displacements is got multiple materials, it will only make displacements for those that have blend materials. This other option here, skip tools, will mean like if you have no drawer, etc., none of those faces will get turned into displacements. The selected only means only the polygons that are in the current polygon, the face selection of the objects will get turned into displacements. This is the old method that used to always be the main way to control it. But over time and experience, I learned that a lot of times it's a lot easier just to make sure you're just skipping tools and set your objects up in advance. In this case, we only have one material, so we don't have to worry about the skipping tools. But I keep it on by default. I always keep this on. I never have that off myself. And personally, I usually also only use blends, so that's an option too. Another one here is you can have material names. You can give a comma-separated list of names that will only generate the displacements from those names, and it's the full path to the material. If I wanted to just make displacements and that's it, I would click this button here and it would make the displacements. But there's a more powerful set of tools here, and it's called the multi-step displacements. And there's a couple options. Again, it uses these up here when it makes them, but then it does a few extra steps for you and it automates these for you. I'm going to go ahead and turn on collapse also for a reason you'll see in here. So what's going to happen is I have this terrain selected, and I'm just going to click this terrain button. Now, because I hit collapse, it's given me this warning. And you might want to not collapse the objects in this case, but in our case, we do want to collapse them because when this generates a backbone of brushes behind the scene, it uses a type of geometry inside a wallworm called a ShelvX object. The ShelvX object is really cool, but it can be slow to calculate, so it's a little bit faster for performance down the road to not keep it parametric. And the thing is, with displacements, you don't want to change the brushes underneath them inside a wallworm very much unless you really know what you're doing. And I'm not going to get into videos on that kind of stuff. So as much as possible, once you start making displacements, you have to remember not to mess with the geometry, the brushes that are under the hood controlling them. So I'm going to hit yes to continue. So I did pause there while that ran. It took several minutes. You're going to see a bunch of jumbled chaos in the viewport for the moment. I'm going to explain what's going on here and what happened. And it may look crazy, but it's a big time saver what happened. So the primary thing is we now have a Sculpt Mesh in Max that lets us work with all of the displacements as if it's one thing. And this is very important because it allows us to efficiently apply modifiers in sculpting. And by default, when a Sculpt Mesh is created, it immediately goes to a sculpting mode. So in the freeform tools, you'll notice we're on a push-pull button right here, and I can start sculpting. But we're not going to do that right now. I'm actually going to now explain to you what was made exactly and why and how and what these things mean. So the first thing is you're going to notice that there's all these no draw textures everywhere, and it's kind of like fighting for in the viewport, a bunch of Z fighting, overlapping. I'm going to select this outside object here and isolate the selection. And you're going to notice that basically one brush was made for every single quad in the scene from that template terrain that we had. Now, for this particular scene, I'm actually going to delete this mesh. This mesh is fully safe to delete. You'll notice that it's called terrain brush with the word no draw at the end. Perfectly safe to delete. In my case, it's actually not optimal for the layout, and I've already sealed the map. But the purpose of this is to quickly put behind all of your displacements no draw brushes, so that you don't have to make those, and they follow the general contour of your terrain. I don't need that. I made one custom that you're going to see in a little bit already, very optimized, way less brushes, and this is overkill. Plus, I'm going to want this to be an arch. I don't want a no draw going across here. Now, if you did want to keep some of this, it is fully safe to go into element subobject mode. Every element is a brush. So if I were to select this element, hit delete, you're going to see these are different brushes that get created. You can keep some of it and optimize it pieces away, but again, it just depends on what your needs are. If you just need something quick, that standing up brushes behind your displacements, this is the way to go. And that's what this Create No Draw Brushes option did. I didn't need it. I don't want to use it. I'm actually going to hit delete and go back to our view over here with our displacements. Now, notice that when we created this displacement, it was using the orange in our blend material. Bring back our blend example here. It was displaying as orange, and now it's all of a sudden suddenly gray. And that's because the blend materials in Wallworm are dependent on vertex colors to determine which of the two materials to show. Our template didn't have any vertex coloring, and it just defaulted to one of those two. And now when we apply it, it's using whichever it created vertex colors for these, Vertex Alpha actually. And that's why the current default Vertex Alpha is showing all gray. Well, now we'll get to paint those and blend between them as we need, but we're not going to do that at this very second. In our next phase, we're going to relax the landscape a little bit. Obviously, right now it's very square because we started with these quad polygons everywhere. And to help us visualize this, I'm actually going to change a view mode. So you can't see it really well because of all the edge faces, but you see up here where it says edge faces, let's go to clay mode. Switching to clay mode kind of lets us visualize the terrain a little bit easier. I can hit F4 to toggle it on and off as needed. So just remember that F4 lets you toggle the edge faces. So I have this displacement Sculpt Mesh selected, and we can start adding modifiers to this. And I'm actually going to hide my ribbon for the moment to give us some more viewport real estate to look at things. And now, before we add any modifiers, it is very important to remember this. One limitation of working with a Sculpt Mesh inside a Wallworm is that you must be very, very, very strict about this rule. You cannot delete or add faces to this thing. So you cannot add any type of modifier that will add any faces to it. You can use other modifiers like the one I'm about to talk about, the relax modifier. Now the relax modifier works very similarly to the way the subdivide modifier works inside of Hammer. So let's go here and look at this, hit F4 again so we can see this. Now watch what happens. I can change these values up and see that the landscape starts getting blended down. Now depending on how much blending you want to do will depend on how you want to do this. I don't want it to be super mushy, so I do want a little bit of a lip here, and then I'm going to sculpt things later, but we're smoothing it out a little bit so it's not so harsh everywhere. All right, you can look around your scene. And another thing to notice is the outside edges start to get these little grooves like this. So you can click Keep Boundaries Fixed, in which case you'll stay flat like that. And you can also have this other option for Save Outer Corners. And they will both have a slightly different effect. I'm going to have Keep Boundary Points, but turn off Save Outer Corners, because you'll notice if I turn on Save Outer Corners, I get a very jagged type look and things like this, and that's not really what I want. I want it to be kind of smooth on the inside, but keep the outside kind of how it was originally. I'm going to sculpt those very explicitly with the sculpting tools myself as we get a little bit further along. We can keep this relax modifier on here as long as we want, but I already know I'm never going to come back and change this. This is the value I want. So in that case, we can right click and choose convert to, and choose editable poly. This is important. Don't go to mesh or patch. Always keep your Sculpt Mesh and editable poly. I can collapse this down, and this is still going to be properly tied as my Sculpt Mesh. Now I'm going to show you a couple things to know about when working with the Sculpt Meshes. In the Modify tab, you'll find that there's a rollout called Wallworm Functions when you have an editable poly as a Sculpt Mesh selected. All of these parameters are used for kind of working with the data and visualizing things and changing values on the displacements. It's important to understand that this Sculpt Mesh is not actually the displacements that goes into the game. It's kind of a proxy of all the displacements in the scene, and all of the values in it are mapped to the displacements that actually get exported. So what we do is we're sculpting on this thing, but if we want to send data to a specific set of displacements under the hood, we have tools that do that. We'll explore a couple of those. So if I'm in polygon subobject mode, and if I select a polygon inside of here, you'll notice that there is some buttons in here. One is like expand to displacements. If I click that, it's going to expand and select and show you what polygons are shared on the underlying displacement. And whenever you have polygons selected like this, you can go down and apply certain things to whatever set of polygons is selected to the displacements from them. So for example, if you want to change the light map scale of this polygon or this displacement, or change different physics settings, you can do that by selecting them, hit expand to displacements to show. So if I go like this and hit expand, you'll see that it expands and shows you all. And then you can change by checking or unchecking these and setting the values for those. I'm not going to do any of that really right now, but I wanted you to be aware that here in the Modify tab are all of these functions for working with your Sculpt Mesh. Any of the changes that you do to your Sculpt Mesh, again, are not automatically propagated to your displacements. You have to do this process called committing. So there's multiple methods to get to the commit functions. One of them is here in the Modify tab under this button that says Commit All Changes. When you do that, the changes to every displacement in the entire Sculpt Mesh will get propagated to the underlying displacements. If you click this button that says Commit Selected Changes Only, in this case it would only update the topology of the selected displacement faces here, and everything else would remain as it is. To help you also understand a little bit more about Wallworm and how the displacements are organized and such, I'm going to open up this Viz Group Manager. If I click this button, it's opening up on my other screen, so let me bring it over here. The Viz Group Manager is very similar to that in Hammer. You can create your own Viz groups, and you can also see that there are automatic Viz groups. In this case, you'll see that there's a category called displacements, and then there's power to displacements, because that's the only kind I have in the scene, and it's unchecked because they're all hidden. If I click this, you're going to see it's listing under the hood all of those actual displacements, and these are objects in the scene that represent the actual individual displacements, but they're hidden. And then we have the Sculpt Mesh. Now if I hide the Sculpt Mesh but show the power to displacements, you're going to see that even though my Sculpt Mesh has been updated with the smooth relaxing, the actual displacements are not, because I have not committed the results of that Sculpt Mesh to these items yet. So if I were to export the scene into the game and I run around in here in CSGO, you would see that everything is still flat. None of it would be smooth. None of those faces are relaxed. So how do we commit those? Again, we saw the option here in the Modify tab. I'm actually going to go ahead and click that button, and you're going to see that it's going to update these displacements that are under the hood, which were hidden, but I've demonstrated those here so you can. I've unhid them here so you can see them and watch what happens. Now the commit function can take a little while. This Sculpt Mesh is composed of something like 4,000 and some displacements. That's quite a bit of displacements to add or an update, so it might take a minute or two to update all of these. So you'll notice that they all disappeared. Don't panic. The sculpt meshes are designed to automatically, when you run functions that deal with them, it's designed to automatically hide the actual displacements, because the intent is that you always work on the sculpt meshes. But let me unhide those again, and you're going to see these are now have been updated with the subdivide. So if I export the game now, it will show this subdivision of the displacements. And again, if I go to the Modify tab here and open up the command panel, this set of displacements gets hidden again automatically. And that's something that's built into Wallworm to hide those, because you really aren't supposed to work with those objects. You're supposed to work with the Sculpt Mesh. And notice whenever you do commit, you're going to see in the MaxScript listener down here, it'll tell you how long it actually takes to commit the entire Sculpt Mesh. And it's also recorded in the Modify tab, and it will always show you when the last one was committed and how long it took. And that's one reason why we have this commit selected only changes. If you have a Sculpt Mesh that's thousands like this, committing all of them when you're only working on one small section is kind of intrusive, so you can select different areas and only commit those by using that method. So now let's explore sculpting this a little bit. So let's bring back the toolbar, the graphite toolbar. And again, as I warned you earlier, when it comes to adding or removing polygons, you have to remember that when you're using these tools up here, you only use those tools that change vertex positions. You do not use anything that adds any faces to this. For example, do not use branches, strips, topology, step build, or extend. Just do not ever use those on a sculpt mesh. You are, however, free to use all of these tools that are over here for sculpting your terrain. So I'm going to start with the relax brush, and you can see in the viewport, it might be slightly hard to see this circle. If I Control Shift left mouse button, I can visually change the radius, and if I Alt Shift my left mouse button, you're going to see the strength spinner has a line going up here. There's also, it's on my other viewport here, sorry, this little floater that's always there that shows you the size, so you can type in sizes and strength as well. So I'm gonna type in a size of 400 here. That's kind of the size I want to work with this relax. So we already have a relax that we did with that modifier across the whole mesh, and now I kind of want to target different areas more explicitly. So I might go through here and just go and relax different areas. So depending on the effect that you're trying to get, you'll have to change the size and strength of these. And this is going to take me quite a while to sculpt this exactly as I want. But I'm just going to go through here and do some sculpting. And as you start doing this kind of stuff, you'll end up doing things back and forth and looking at things from different angles. And you might go back and forth between the sculpting and the push-pull tool and the shift tool. I personally love using the shift tool a lot, but you have to be very careful, and we'll talk about that in a minute. So in this terrain, I kind of want to have a slope that goes really low out in the ocean, and then it comes up towards, there's going to be a mountain up here, a volcano in the background behind all of this. So I can use the shift tool and grab this from the side here. And you have to be very careful because it's in a mode, it's my floater's on the other screen again. I normally use the other bigger monitor, but I'm recording here. So it's in a mode that's called depth. And by depth, it means everything in front, every pixel in front or behind the circle from the plane of the perspective is going to be affected by this. So I'm going to grab all of this and just drag it down. I want it to go down into the ocean here. And then some of these, I've got to be careful here because I don't really want that part sticking up to come down over there. But you will sometimes see glitches where it will grab polygons that you don't intend. And if it's doing that, see in the foreground, it's grabbing things that I don't want here. Let's switch to orthographic view just to see if that will help me with this problem. Sometimes changing to orthographic views works better with projected functions. So let me change this shift again, and we'll see if I can grab this now. Yes, I can. So now I can grab this and bring it down and not worry about things that I don't expect getting grabbed. And I want to grab and bring this stuff up over here because I want this stuff to be going up in the sky. And I'm actually going to have these leaning out a little bit. Make it a little bit interesting, up and down a little bit. But the overall effect is from low to high. And I wanted a little bit of this sticking up over here. I have a water brush, but we'll expose that in a little bit after. So I have this general feel of it going from low, like arms reaching down from the mountain out into the ocean. All right. So this guy, we want to do a little bit of relaxing. I'm going to make this brush a little bit bigger. Let's do 800 for this. Let's see, it might be too big, but and I'm going to use now the push-pull tool. I want this to kind of be like a mushroom head type thing. And then after we get some pushing and pulling out here, then I'm going to use the shift tool again a little bit. Give it some interesting shapes. And we'll come back to it and sculpt it some more as we keep going here. So relax some of this up a little bit. Now, one thing to keep in mind is when you're doing dragging with the shift tool and other tools, you don't want the polygons intersecting on your anywhere on your displacement. So you got to be mindful of that kind of thing and always go back in and relax things out or push them out and be careful of it. Got a bunch of terrorists spawning in this little tunnel here. We're going to have to push these out a little bit because I know that I have some node draws underneath there, but we'll unhide those in a little bit after we've gotten this a little bit more relaxed out a little bit. So it's going to take some time, and I think that at this point I'm going to just shut up and do a little bit and record the actions, and then we'll come talk about it after a bit. So I spent a couple hours sculpting that. Unfortunately, I was distracted halfway through, and when I came back to the office, I forgot to hit record. But this is the results that you see after a couple hours of sculpting. Got a pretty interesting landscape here now. I've got most of the main shapes that I wanted in the archways through all the paths. And again, you can see how using clay mode helps you sculpt and create some features. Now there's another section here that I'm wanting to show you how to sculpt procedurally, and I'm going to use the mountain face on the back side to use this technique to show you. So we're going to use a texture to drive the displacement on that backside instead of sculpting it manually like I did for the rest of the scene. So first we're going to start by selecting, we need to add a UVW map onto this. And we already have on this UV channel 1 used for the materials, the textures that are currently on there. For this one, we're going to use one called XYZ to UVW. And this one will allow us to use procedural textures on the mesh in a pretty interesting way, which you'll see in a minute here. I also don't want to overwrite channel 1 because we're already using that for our textures at the moment. So instead, we're going to put it on another channel. I'm just going to put it on channel 4. It's an arbitrary channel. Could use 2 or 3, but I'm going to give it up a little bit in case I want to use those other channels for other things. So now that I have this on here, I can then, I'm going to go ahead and just bake this down to an editable poly, so I don't need that extra modifier anymore for the moment. So that data is baked in. So now we want to add a displace modifier. And remember, we use channel 4 for our UVs for this. So we want to hit Use Existing Mapping and go to channel 4. Now what we need to do is open the Material Editor, which I have open on my other screen. And we need to get a texture. So in this case, I want to use a cellular texture. So under General, we have one called Cellular. And this texture is going to drive the displacements on this. Now, we need to tell this cellular to also use map channel 4. So let's go to explicit map channel 4 and type in 4 here. So now this texture can be applied to our displace. In this case, I want to use one called chips. This is a chip mode here. And if I pipe this texture into our displace modifier, and now if I take the power of this and start going up, you're going to notice that the entire mesh across the entire scene is getting all of this effect here. Now, I don't want this across the entire mesh. I only want it on the mountains. So let's see how we can do that. So first, to limit this effect, let's go down to our editable poly, and let's go to polygon or border selection. We'll make it, I'll show you a technique here. And I'm going to turn off the displace at the end so this goes faster. So I'm going to just select the border. I'm going to switch it to edge mode. So now it's got an edge selection across the entire mesh. Let's isolate the selection so we only have this. Now let's remove anything by Alt selecting any edge that I do not want to use in my selection here. And now I want to convert this to right click and convert it to a vertex selection. So now we're just on the vertices on the top here. Now I'm just going to grow this down until we get down to the base of this wall here. And if we have vertices that we don't want involved in this, we can Alt select those. Alt is the negative function for most things in Max. So I do not want I only want the wall there. And we can see that this came out a little bit over here. Let's get rid of this selection. And let's get rid of this. So now you can see that we've only got the wall here. And there's many ways we could have done that. I just wanted to show you some simple techniques that you can start using to think about ways to select and use different tools different ways. All right, so now that we have those selected, I see that we have some on that wall that are not, so I'm going to hit Control and reselect those ones on that wall there. Let's get some of these out of there. Okay. Now, because we have this vertex selection, and we still are in vertex subobject mode, when we go up to our displace modifier, it's only going to be affected on those selected faces. So I enabled it. So notice here, the rest of the mesh is not being displaced. Next thing we want to do is kind of control this, how this is looking here. Now that we have this selected the way we want, let's go back to the material editor and start changing this material, the parameters for it. I'm going to put it here like this so we can see. And let's get a view of it so we can look up at it. So we're going to have to change these parameters to something that we want. So I want them to stretch up, actually, so we can visualize this a little bit more. I'm not sure if we're going to be able to actually see the texture in here to visualize this much, but I'm going to stretch it up by changing the tiling, maybe something like this, so it's stretched, the effect of this. I think that the size of this is going to have to be a lot larger. Let's try 600, maybe a little bit more. All right, so let's go back to our displace. Let's move it out here so we can see that this is kind of looking like that. Let's see what it might look like. Oh, it's looking a little bit too blocky here. Let's change the, let's see if we can bring down the, I don't know. Let's bring this down some. No, that's too much. Let's stretch this out a little bit more. Not sure that's the direction I'm wanting to tile these in. And that is. It was the the W. Sorry about that. I was thinking about projecting from the side in UV space. So let's do this to 1 again there, and see what this looks like. A little bit more interesting. Play with these a little bit until we kind of get something that really feels like a mountainside. So this technique is useful for creating procedural terrains. We're going to have to relax this out a little bit right here. This The vertices are all too close together for this, so after we're done displacing, we'll have to relax it some. But you can use this technique to drive any kind of procedural material to drive a system, which is really cool. So unfortunately, the scale of the with this scale using explicit map channel with this preview, we don't get to see it. So I'm going to actually move that off the side a little bit here. Oop, keeps on snapping out of my view. All right, let's see here. Let's turn on the fractal mode a little bit. All right, I'm thinking this is looking kind of the way I was wanting it. I'm gonna have to do some relaxing on the borders. I could have actually, maybe if I go down here to vertex mode and turn on soft selection. This might help us a little bit in some of that transition. I'm still going to have to soften this up, but it made it not quite as harsh, I think. So that gives you an overview of a technique to do your sculpting on your terrain. I'm going to go ahead and collapse this. I could keep this procedural all the way, but I think I like it how it is, and I'm going to go through here and convert this to an editable poly. Again, remember, never mesh or patch, always editable poly for source engine displacement here. All right, let's go here and bring out the ribbon again. Let's do some relaxing. Don't need it quite that big. My tool's on the other screen now. Let's do 300 size. Might hit F4 to see these vertices here. You just don't want your polygons intersecting, self-intersections on your displacements. You never want that. You always want to make sure you don't have that. So in this case, I'm probably going to have to do a little bit of extra work to separate some of these in here. So I think that this recording is getting long enough. It covered the topic that I wanted to share with you most, and that is sculpting a terrain with wallworm and doing it quickly. You can see that this entire terrain was made in a couple hours. It didn't take that much effort. You learned several techniques here. So to recap, what we learned was that you can take any arbitrary mesh and open the wallworm displacement tools, which are in my other monitor again. And you can use this terrain button to take any template mesh that you want as a template for making your terrain displacements, and it will just generate those for you. It has several benefits. I've had many conversations over the years where a lot of classic level designers from the Hammer world are insistent that you can't make completely crazy organic terrains out of displacements that seamlessly sew to each other. But yes, you can. You just have to understand how to work with different tools than Hammer. So this is one technique to show you how to do that. So these tools are very important. Taught you that the displacement here, the Sculpt Mesh, needs to be committed before it can be sent into the game engine. So I'm going to hit commit now while I'm talking, and it will update all the under the hood displacements. We learned how to use some of the brushes inside of Max for sculpting, including these in the graphite toolbar for shift. I love shift. It's really cool. Again, remember that there's two modes. There's radius mode and there's depth mode. They both are very useful, but depth is very challenging if you don't understand what you're doing. So learn about how it works. There's also the relax and push and pull and flatten and noise, which I used during the section that I forgot to record. And there's all kinds of tools that you can use to really make your environment exactly how you want. It's a lot of fun. You also learned how to use textures to sculpt. We did that with the XYZ to UVW, UV mapping mode, and the displace modifier with the cellular map in Slate. So a very small number of tools allows you to get this very complex, organic looking environment that I'm looking forward to progressing on here and sharing with you. The next episode of this, I'll go over some of the texture blending. We'll create our own material, set of materials for this with texture blending and seamless scale. And I also look forward to start inserting a bunch of assets that my son Ethan Olson is working on that we're going to use in the upcoming tutorials that will include using RailClone and Forest Pack and some other plugins that come with Wallworm. So I hope you enjoyed this. I love sharing this with you, and I hope you all have as much fun playing with these tools as I do. My name is Sean Olson. Thank you, and have a good day.